Rancher bought a cabin sight unseen. Inside, he found a beautiful woman living there. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was the kind of decision that many would question. David Grant, a solitary rancher in the dusty, unforgiving plains of the American West, had always lived by a simple rule: never make impulsive decisions. Yet, that very rule seemed to slip away one rainy afternoon when he came across an advertisement for a small cabin, miles from any other sign of life, located deep in the wilderness of the Montana Territory. The cabin was listed for an unbelievably low price, and without much hesitation, David took the plunge. He didn't inspect it first, trusting the brief description and the notion of seclusion that had always called to him. It had been months since he had felt the weight of another person's presence, and the thought of owning his own quiet piece of land, untouched and far from any other settlement, appealed to him more than anything. Weeks later, after the ink had dried on the deal and the cabin was officially his, David made his way to the property. His heart raced with anticipation as the old wooden structure came into view. It was exactly as the advertisement had described: small, weathered, and secluded. The rain poured down in sheets, but David didn't mind. It felt like the beginning of something new, something different. With his boots squelching in the mud, he made his way inside, eager to claim his new home. But what he found inside shocked him to the core. There, sitting by the fire, was a woman. She was young, with dark, wild hair that framed her face, and eyes that looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Her clothes were simple, worn, and clearly meant for someone who had been living off the land for much longer than David had anticipated. "Who are you?" David asked, his voice tight with confusion. The woman stood up quickly, her movements cautious but graceful. She eyed him warily, but there was a strange sense of recognition in her gaze. "I could ask you the same question," she replied softly. "This is my home. Who are you to come here?" David blinked in disbelief. He had bought this cabin sight unseen, and it had never crossed his mind that someone could already be living here. He looked around, wondering if this was some sort of mistake. But the woman didn't look like she was about to leave, nor did she appear frightened of him. Instead, she seemed calm, almost as though she belonged there. David's mind raced as he processed the situation. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was beyond anything he had expected. The cabin was supposed to be his, yet this woman had somehow made it hers. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something deeper was at play here. And as the rain continued to beat against the windows, David realized that his quiet retreat had just turned into a mystery he wasn't sure he was prepared to solve. David stood there, frozen in place as the woman in front of him slowly lowered herself back onto the worn leather chair by the fire. The room was dimly lit, with only the flickering light from the flames dancing across her face, casting shadows that made her seem even more mysterious. The cabin felt smaller now, more intimate, as if her presence had somehow made it come alive in a way he hadn't anticipated. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced. This was his cabin, his property, yet here she was, as if she belonged. "I'm sorry," David finally managed to say, his voice uncertain. "I didn't expect anyone to be here." The woman didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked at him with an unreadable expression, as though trying to decide what to make of him. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers tapping lightly, nervously. "I'm not here by choice," she said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "This cabin was always meant to be a refuge, but not for me. I never wanted to be here. But now it's all I have." David felt a sharp pang of guilt. He had come here expecting peace and solitude, a place where he could escape the stresses of his life. But what he had found instead was a woman clearly struggling with her own battles. He stepped further into the cabin, carefully avoiding the few scattered items that lay on the floor. He wasn't sure whether he should leave or stay, but something told him that this wasn't the simple misunderstanding it had seemed at first. "What do you mean? This was never meant to be your home?" he asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The woman hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the fire. She didn't seem like she wanted to explain herself, but David's question seemed to hang in the air, waiting to be answered. I was running, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Running from a life I never wanted. Running from a past that still haunts me. David's chest tightened. He didn't need to ask her to understand that her past was something she didn't want to revisit. He could see the pain in her eyes, the kind of pain that time could never erase. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, she continued, her eyes never leaving the fire. But I had no choice. I thought this cabin would be a place to hide, a place to disappear. But now that you're here, it feels like everything is unraveling. David took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how to handle this situation. Should he help her, or should he leave her to deal with her past on her own? He had never been good at understanding people's pain, especially when it wasn't his own. But there was something about her that made him want to stay, to help her find a way out of whatever she was running from. I don't want to cause you any trouble, David said, his voice steady but gentle. If you want me to leave, I will. But if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. She didn't say anything at first, but her gaze softened. After a long pause, she finally spoke. You're not like the others. I can tell. David didn't know what she meant by that, but something about her words made him feel a little lighter. Maybe, just maybe, he could help her find peace, just as he had hoped to find his own. The silence between them stretched out, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held a promise that the journey ahead wasn't something either of them would face alone. David knew that the path he had chosen wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had made the right decision by coming to this cabin. He was no longer alone in this wilderness, and neither was she. David sat down on the creaky wooden chair across from the woman, who had finally begun to open up. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. But despite the warmth, a cold feeling lingered in the air between them. He could tell she was struggling with something deeper than just her unexpected presence in his new home. He had never been one for confrontation, but there was something about this woman that made him feel he had to know more. She seemed like she was waiting for something, for the right moment, or maybe even for the courage to speak. He couldn't blame her. After all, it wasn't every day that a complete stranger shows up in your home, uninvited and confused. You don't have to tell me everything, David said gently, trying to break the silence. But if you want to talk, I'm here to listen. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something. Then, slowly, she nodded. My name is Emily, she said, her voice still quiet, almost hesitant. I never meant for things to turn out this way. I didn't ask for any of this. David watched as she spoke, her hands twisting in her lap, fingers fidgeting with the frayed edges of her dress. She seemed smaller now, as though her words were slowly draining her of energy. I ran away from my life, Emily continued, her eyes shifting to the fire again. From everything. From the people who hurt me, from the people who never understood me. I thought if I could find a place like this, a place where no one knew me, I could start over. I could forget. David felt a pang of sympathy for her. He had never known the kind of pain she was describing, but he understood what it was like to want to escape, to leave everything behind in search of peace. And you've been here all alone? David asked. Emily nodded, her eyes meeting his once again. Yes, but it's not really living. I thought I could make it work, that I could be strong enough. But, she paused, her voice catching in her throat. But it's hard. It's harder than I thought. David sat back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure what to say. He could offer her words of comfort, but something told him that wouldn't be enough. She needed more than that. She needed a way out. What happened? He asked, his voice softer now. Why were you running? The question hung in the air for a long moment before Emily spoke again. There's a man I've been trying to get away from for years. He's the reason I'm here. She closed her eyes, her face shadowed by the memories. He's dangerous, David. He won't stop until he finds me. He's done things. Terrible things. David felt the weight of her words sink in. He had always heard the rumors about men like the one Emily was describing. Men who left nothing behind but destruction and fear. He had never encountered one himself, but he had heard enough to know the kind of danger she was in. You don't have to face this alone, David said, his voice steady and sure. I'll help you. I'll make sure he doesn't find you. Emily shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. I don't want to drag you into this, she whispered. You don't know what he's capable of. David stood up, his resolve strengthening. I don't care what he's capable of. You don't deserve to live in fear. I'm not leaving here without you. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting shadows on the walls as David's words hung in the air. Emily stared at him, her face softening as a tear slipped down her cheek. She had been running for so long, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the burden lift just a little. She didn't have to face this alone. Not anymore. The silence between them was different now, no longer filled with tension or uncertainty. It was filled with the promise of something better, something David wasn't sure he could name yet, but something that felt right. They would face whatever came next together, and for the first time, Emily didn't feel completely alone. David sat by the small wooden table, his hand resting on the edge as he stared at Emily, who was still seated by the fire. The weight of her confession lingered in the air, thick and heavy. The man she had spoken of, the one who had haunted her for so long, was a specter that had yet to fully materialize in their lives. David knew that whatever came next, he could no longer pretend to live in peace. The quiet, solitary life he had dreamed of was no longer possible. Not with Emily in danger. Not with a man like that on the loose. He had promised to help her, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter the cost. We need to prepare, David said quietly, his voice steady. If this man is coming for you, we can't sit here and wait. We need to be ready. Emily looked at him, her face pale, but resolute. What do you mean? How can we be ready? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. David stood up, his boots creaking as he moved to the window and peered out at the stormy landscape. The wind howled outside, the rain beating against the cabin walls. We'll need to fortify the cabin, make sure we have enough supplies to last us. And we'll need to figure out how to defend ourselves if he finds us. Emily stood up as well, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. David, you don't know what he's like. You don't understand what he'll do to get to me. He's not just any man. He's someone who's capable of anything. David turned to face her, his gaze unwavering. I know, Emily. I know more than you think. But I'm not going to let you face him alone. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. I never wanted this, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I never wanted to bring danger to your doorstep. David walked over to her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. You didn't ask for any of this, he said softly. But you're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. There was a long pause, the tension between them palpable, but it was a different kind of tension now. It wasn't the tension of uncertainty or fear. It was the tension of two people, bound by a shared purpose. Emily looked up at him, her tears slowly subsiding. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. David smiled, though it was a tight, strained smile. We'll get through this together. They spent the next few hours preparing. David had a small stash of tools and supplies from his earlier visits to the cabin, but they would need more. They would need food, water, blankets, and ammunition. They needed to make sure the cabin was locked down tight, and that they were ready for anything. As they worked, Emily began to relax slightly, though the fear still lingered in her eyes. She helped him gather firewood and set up a makeshift barricade along the windows, though she was hesitant, unsure of her own strength. David noticed, but didn't comment. He understood that this was all new to her. This wasn't the kind of life she had planned for, and he could see the weight of it in the way she moved, as though she was trying to outrun something that had already caught up to her. As the night wore on, the storm outside intensified, and the cabin felt smaller, more isolated. The sound of the rain tapping against the roof was a constant reminder of how alone they were in this wilderness. But now, they weren't just two strangers thrown together by chance. They were a team. They were united in a common cause. When the last of the supplies had been secured, and the cabin had been fortified as best as they could manage, David finally allowed himself a moment of rest. He sat down on the small cot by the wall, his eyes flickering to Emily as she sat in the corner, her knees pulled up to her chest. She was still trembling, but there was a quiet strength in her now, a spark of determination that hadn't been there before. David knew that this was only the beginning. The man who was after her would come, eventually. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough to face whatever came next. The storm outside raged on, its fury matching the growing tension inside the cabin. David sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, while Emily paced back and forth, her nerves clearly on edge. The preparations they had made that night were the best they could manage with limited resources, but neither of them felt completely safe. David kept glancing toward the window, the rain pouring down in sheets, but it was the unsettling stillness that worried him. They were alone in this desolate place, and there was no telling when the man Emily had been running from would show up. The hours dragged on in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, waiting for a storm that they knew would inevitably come. Emily stopped pacing and sat down beside David, her eyes wide with anxiety. "What if he finds us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he knows where we are?" David set down the knife and looked at her, his face hardening with determination. "He won't find us. Not if we're careful. We've prepared as best as we can, and we'll be ready for whatever comes." Emily nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the door. She had lived in fear for so long that it was hard for her to imagine anything other than the worst. David could see it in her eyes, the terror, the uncertainty. "You're not alone anymore," he said, trying to reassure her. "We'll face this together." Emily finally looked at him, her face softening for the first time that evening. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she whispered. David felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. He wasn't the kind of man who often let people in, but there was something about Emily that made him want to protect her. He had already promised her that he wouldn't leave, and he meant it. Suddenly, the sound of hooves in the distance broke the silence, causing both of them to freeze. The unmistakable rhythm of riders coming closer. David's heart skipped a beat. "Get the rifle," he said, his voice low and steady. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she scrambled to obey. She handed David the rifle, and he moved to the window, carefully peering out through a small crack in the wooden frame. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. A group of men on horseback, moving fast through the rain, their faces obscured by the storm, but their intentions clear. They were coming. For them. David turned to Emily, his face grim. "Get to the back. Stay hidden, no matter what." Emily nodded, her face pale. She had been through enough to know that there was no time for second-guessing. She moved quickly to the back of the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. David stood by the window, watching the riders draw closer. They were too far to make out any details, but there was no mistaking the fact that they were headed straight for the cabin. His mind raced, weighing his options. He could try to confront them, but that could end in disaster. There was too much at stake. He needed to protect Emily, and he needed to do it without drawing attention to himself. The sound of the horses grew louder, the rain masking the movement until the men were nearly at the door. David's fingers tightened around the rifle, his body coiled like a spring, ready to react. The door creaked as it rattled against the wind, and for a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. The men were close now. Too close. David's pulse quickened as he waited for the inevitable. He could hear the low murmur of voices outside, the men talking in hushed tones, though their words were indecipherable. His grip tightened on the rifle. He had to make sure they didn't get inside. He couldn't let them harm Emily. The wind howled louder, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound of the horses stopped. There was an eerie silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots crunching in the wet dirt outside the cabin. David held his breath. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for. The men were here. The sound of boots crunching through the wet earth grew louder, echoing in the tense silence of the cabin. David's heart hammered in his chest, his fingers tightly gripping the rifle as he moved away from the window, making his way quietly to the back of the room. He needed to be ready. Emily was hiding in the shadows, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her eyes wide with fear. David knew she was terrified, but there was nothing he could do to take away that fear. All he could do now was protect her. The door creaked once more as the men outside began to surround the cabin, their presence unmistakable. David crouched low, taking slow, deliberate breaths. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have fully readied him for the reality of it. He could feel the weight of the rifle in his hands, its cold steel a reminder of the danger outside. The men outside were speaking in low tones, their words indistinct in the wind, but there was no mistaking the urgency in their voices. David's mind raced as he pieced together the situation. These men were here for Emily. She had been running from them for years, and now they had finally caught up. David couldn't let them take her. He wouldn't. The men grew closer, and David's pulse quickened. He knew they would try to break in. There was no doubt in his mind that they would force their way inside if they thought it meant getting to her. The thought made his blood boil. He wasn't going to let them hurt her. Not on his watch. He moved toward the door, staying low, keeping his footsteps light. Emily was behind him, silent, watching him with a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. She trusted him, and he couldn't afford to let her down. He could hear the men now, their footsteps heavy as they approached the door. The first knock was soft, tentative, but the second came with force. It was clear they weren't here to ask for directions. David's muscles tensed as he positioned himself in front of the door, rifle raised, ready to defend. The door shook with another forceful knock, followed by a voice. "We know you're in there," the man called out, his voice rough and commanding. "This is your last chance. Open the door, and we won't hurt you." David's jaw tightened. He knew better than to fall for their threats. These men weren't interested in negotiating. They weren't here to talk. They were here to take. And if David wasn't careful, they might take more than just Emily. "We're not opening the door," David called back, his voice steady. "You'll have to go through me first." There was a pause, a long stretch of silence that seemed to last forever. Then the men outside laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that made David's blood run cold. "If that's how you want it," the leader said, his tone dripping with menace. David's heart skipped a beat as he heard the men move around the cabin, their footsteps now coming from all directions. They were preparing to break in. The sound of wood splintering echoed in the air, and David's grip tightened around the rifle. It was only a matter of time before they made their move. He glanced over at Emily, who was still crouched in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. He needed to buy them time, to keep her safe. David moved to the back window, slowly pushing the curtain aside just enough to peek out. What he saw made his stomach drop. There were at least 6 men, maybe more, all armed and ready. They had come for one thing, Emily, and they weren't leaving without her. The situation was more dangerous than he had ever anticipated, and there was no way he could take on 6 armed men by himself. He had to think fast, but his mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. He had promised Emily that he would protect her, and now, that promise was all that mattered. With a deep breath, David turned to Emily. "Stay hidden," he said, his voice low but firm. "No matter what happens, don't come out." Emily nodded, tears welling up in her eyes as she clutched the corner of her shawl tightly. David's gaze hardened. He was going to make sure these men never laid a hand on her. He wasn't going to let them take her. The first blow hit the door with a loud crash, splintering the wood. David raised the rifle, his heart pounding in his ears. It was time to make his stand. The door exploded inward with a deafening crash, the wood splintering violently as the first man charged through, his boots slamming against the floor. David's heart raced, but his body was calm, instinctively ready. In one swift motion, he lifted the rifle and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the cabin. The man stumbled back, a look of surprise on his face as he fell to the floor, clutching his shoulder. The others outside hesitated, unsure of how to react. David's eyes darted toward the window, watching the shadows of the men move in the rain-soaked darkness. He knew they wouldn't back down. The moment he had fired, the fight had begun, and there was no turning back. "Get down," David shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Emily, who had been crouched in the corner, quickly ducked behind a sturdy wooden crate. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her hands trembling, but she did as he asked. She knew David wouldn't leave her to fight alone. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as David prepared for the next wave of attackers. He was outnumbered, but he wouldn't let them take her. He couldn't. The sound of more men rushing to the door filled the room, and David steadied himself. He knew his position wasn't ideal. The cabin was small, and there was no real cover. But he had the advantage of surprise, and he'd use it to his benefit. The second man lunged toward the door, a knife in hand, but David was faster. He fired again, the bullet striking the man square in the chest. He collapsed instantly, a dark stain spreading across his shirt as he hit the ground. The remaining men, now seeing their comrades fall one by one, hesitated. David didn't give them time to regroup. He moved quickly, his rifle ready, his eyes sharp, scanning every corner of the room for movement. He could hear their heavy breathing, the shuffle of boots on the wooden floor, and the faint rustle of their coats. They were closing in, but they were wary now. They knew this wouldn't be easy. David's mind was racing, calculating his next move. He couldn't let them get too close. He had to keep them at bay long enough for Emily to get to safety. The sound of the door cracking open again sent a chill through him. A third man, bigger and stronger than the rest, stepped into the cabin, his eyes narrowing as he locked onto David. The man raised his weapon, a heavy revolver, and aimed it directly at David. The tension in the room was suffocating. Time seemed to slow as both men stared at each other, the sound of the rain outside deafening in its absence. David's finger hovered over the trigger, but he held back, calculating the distance between them. The man was close, too close. If he fired now, he might miss, and that could be the end of everything. He had to wait. The man took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. David exhaled, his muscles coiling like a spring. The moment the man moved, David acted. He fired first, his shot ringing out just as the other man's bullet whizzed past him, missing by inches. The man staggered back, his hand flying to his chest as he collapsed. David's heart pounded, but there was no time to rest. The last two men were still out there. He could hear them moving, whispering to each other, trying to figure out what to do next. David glanced over at Emily, who was still hidden behind the crate, her face pale with fear, but her eyes wide with determination. He had to end this. Quickly, he moved to the side, staying low, trying to position himself for the next shot. He knew the men would try to flank him, and he couldn't let that happen. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. David's finger tightened on the trigger, his breath steady, his body calm despite the chaos surrounding him. The moment he saw the shadows approaching from the side, he fired again. The bullet struck its mark, and the last of the men dropped to the floor. Silence followed, heavy and thick, broken only by the sound of David's breathing. He kept his rifle aimed at the doorway, waiting for any sign of movement, but none came. The cabin was still. The fight was over. David let out a long breath, lowering his rifle and glancing toward Emily. She was slowly rising from her hiding place, her face still ashen, but now filled with a mixture of awe and relief. David's heart ached at the sight of her. She had been through so much, and he had promised to protect her. He had kept that promise. He walked over to her, his steps slow, cautious. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice steady but strained. Emily nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. David's gaze softened as he reached out to gently touch her arm. "You don't have to thank me. I made a promise." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I never thought I would feel safe again." David smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "You are safe now. No one's going to hurt you." The storm outside began to fade, the rain tapering off as the night settled into an uneasy calm. But for David and Emily, the real battle had just begun. The silence in the cabin was almost deafening after the last shot had echoed through the room. David stood frozen for a moment, his eyes scanning the area, making sure there were no more threats. The rain outside had slowed, but the heavy air remained, thick with tension. His chest heaved as he took slow, steady breaths, trying to calm himself after the intense standoff. Emily was still crouched in the corner, her wide eyes fixed on him. She had witnessed the entire confrontation, the violence, the danger, but she hadn't flinched. There was a quiet strength in her that David hadn't fully realized until now. Slowly, he lowered his rifle and walked toward her, his steps heavy on the wooden floor. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Emily nodded, her face pale but composed. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. You saved us." David gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You did your part too. You stayed hidden. You were brave." Emily's gaze softened as she stood slowly, her body still trembling from the adrenaline. "I never thought I could be brave again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been running for so long, trying to hide, trying to escape. But this felt different. Like I could fight back." David nodded, his eyes searching hers. "You are fighting back. You're not running anymore. And neither am I." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes still filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. David reached out, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. You don't need to thank me, he replied. I made a promise to protect you, and I intend to keep it. We're in this together now. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She had been through so much, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she might be able to find peace. But she knew there was still work to be done. The storm wasn't over yet. David turned and walked to the door, his hand resting on the handle as he peered outside. The rain had stopped, but the storm had left behind a sense of unease. We need to stay alert, he said quietly. They may have been the only ones, but we can't be sure. We'll keep the cabin secure tonight, and in the morning, we'll figure out what to do next. Emily nodded in agreement, her resolve hardening. We'll get through this, she said, her voice firm now. We have to. As David turned back to face her, he couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. There was still so much uncertainty in the world, so many dangers that they couldn't predict, but they had each other. And that was something David hadn't had in a long time. The feeling of companionship, of standing together against whatever came next, was more powerful than he had realized. We will, he said, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of everything they had just survived. The night passed slowly, each of them staying alert, but neither of them spoke much. The storm outside had subsided, but inside, the cabin still felt tense. David spent the night at the window, rifle in hand, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter of the cabin. Emily stayed close, but her mind seemed to be elsewhere, thinking of the past, the future, and everything they had yet to face. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the walls, they both knew something had changed. They were no longer running. They were standing their ground. And whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning light filtered softly through the cabin's small windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden floors. David stood by the window, his eyes scanning the horizon, but the calm of the dawn was deceptive. It was quiet now, but he knew that peace could be fleeting in the wilderness. After the tense night, after the chaos of the attack, the uncertainty of what lay ahead still hung in the air. Yet, something had changed. Emily stood next to him, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, her posture more confident than it had been the night before. They had survived the night. They had faced the danger together, and they had made it through. There was a strength in her now that hadn't been there before, a strength David had always known was buried deep inside her, waiting to be uncovered. It's quiet, Emily said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Too quiet. David nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he thought about the men who had attacked them. They were gone, but David knew that danger never truly disappeared. They won't give up that easily, he said, his voice low but steady. We're not out of danger yet. Emily's gaze shifted to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, an unspoken understanding. But we're stronger now. Together. David turned to face her, his expression softening. Yes, together. The words felt heavier than they should have, but they also carried a sense of resolve. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by chance. They had faced danger, and they had fought back. They were a team now. And in this unforgiving world, that was more than either of them could have hoped for. They spent the morning preparing to leave the cabin, knowing they couldn't stay there forever. They had to keep moving, keep searching for a place where they could be safe. The storm had passed, but the world outside still felt uncertain. They packed what little they had, gathered supplies, and prepared to face whatever came next. Emily moved with purpose now, her movements confident as she helped David load the horses with the supplies they had salvaged. David couldn't help but notice the change in her. There was no hesitation in her steps anymore. She wasn't running from her past anymore. She was facing it, and so was he. As they mounted their horses, ready to leave the cabin behind, David glanced back at the small, weathered building. It had been a place of refuge, a place where they had found each other in the midst of chaos, but it was time to move on. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, David felt like he wasn't alone. The journey ahead was theirs to make, together. The landscape stretched out before them, wild and untamed, but they were no longer afraid of it. They had each other, and that was enough. They would face whatever came next, no matter how dangerous, no matter how uncertain. They had made it this far, and as they rode off into the unknown, David knew one thing for certain. They would continue to survive, continue to fight, because they weren't running anymore. They were living. Discover a thrilling tale of survival, courage, and unexpected alliances in this gripping story set in the rugged wilderness. Follow David, a lone rancher, who unexpectedly becomes entangled in the life of a mysterious woman running from a dangerous past. As the story unfolds, David and the woman must face threats from merciless pursuers, turning the cabin into a battleground where their fate will be decided. As the tension rises, their connection strengthens, and they find themselves fighting not only for survival, but for each other. This story is a prime example of the type of intense, emotional drama that defines Western stories. With every twist and turn, it explores themes of redemption, bravery, and the enduring human spirit. As they face increasingly dire challenges, their resilience is tested in ways they never imagined. The story's depth and character development are hallmarks of great Western stories, capturing the essence of human strength and vulnerability in the face of overwhelming odds. Whether you're a fan of action-packed Western stories or tales of personal growth, this narrative delivers on both fronts. As David and his companion continue their journey through the unforgiving landscape, they prove that even in the harshest conditions, survival and hope are possible. This tale, like many classic Western stories, shows that the greatest battles are often fought not just against the elements, but against the fears and doubts within ourselves. Witness the power of courage, trust, and loyalty as these characters navigate a world where every day is a fight for survival. The resilience of the human spirit is at the core of these Western stories, and this tale is no exception. Join David and Emily on their journey through the rugged terrain, where every moment could be their last, but their determination to survive and protect each other remains unshaken. These Western stories are more than just survival. They are about the unbreakable bond formed between two people who refuse to give up, no matter the cost.